Hey girls, so you're watching this in your group and this video will match with the questions on your sheet. So you need to listen and watch the video to answer the questions, okay? So everybody be quiet and pay attention. This is like an introduction to ancient Egypt, which is what we're going to be talking about. Egypt was a civilization that began about 5,500 years before the year 1. So we're talking about over 7,000 years ago in Egypt, which is in Africa. That's the continent. Egypt is in Africa. And about 5,500 years BCE, people began to settle near the Nile River. Now, the Nile is the longest river in the world, I believe. It's over 4,000 miles long, and it travels from south to north. It travels up against gravity, which is a little weird. Now, why did people settle near the Nile River? Well, a few reasons, but mainly two. One, the river is fresh. All rivers are fresh water, so they could drink. It is the only source of fresh water in Egypt. It does not rain. And two, land near rivers is fertile. And the Nile flooded every year at the same time. And when it flooded, it deposited or threw up this black silt, this black soil that was very fertile, and it made farming easy. In fact, Egypt means gift of the Nile, because without the Nile, we wouldn't have this civilization, Egypt. And they used that land for farming. So people settled near the river because the water is fresh and land near the Nile was fertile. Egyptian history is very long, over 3,000 years long. Because it is so long, historians divide it up to make it easier into three groups: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom of Egypt. And that way it's, give or take about 1,000 years each, and it makes studying Egypt a little bit easier. So we're going to talk a little bit about what life was like in ancient Egypt. So first of all, there was farming. Of course there was farming, because that's how they got the majority of their food. So they would irrigate, they would use irrigation to bring water to their lands. They built canals and had pools. It was all very involved. And they grew a lot of barley and wheat, a lot of different kinds of grain, and because it was easy to grow there. But they had a lot of, fresh fruits. They grew a lot of apples, and they ate very well. They usually had a surplus or extra food. Sometimes there would be times of famine, but they usually stored for that time. Along the Nile, there was a naturally growing reed plant called papyrus. Farmers did not have to plant papyrus. It grows naturally along the Nile River. It's a physical feature of Egypt. So papyrus, this reed plant, which grows naturally, had many uses. They would use it to weave baskets. They would make shoes, hats, and they would even bind it together and let it soak to make paper called papyrus paper. And they would use that to write. Egyptian writing was called hieroglyphics or hieroglyphs. And like the Mesopotamian cuneiform, it began as a pictogram language, little symbols that represented words. But it was easier to read than cuneiform because the symbols looked like the words they represented. Later, they would adopt an alphabet, and then that was much easier to write with. The hieroglyphs can be written and read left to right, right to left, up and down, and even diagonal, which made translating it very difficult, and still does. Just like in Mesopotamia, some rich boys would learn how to read and write. They could become scribes, which are people that write down events. Usually scribes would work for the pharaoh, who we're going to get to in a minute, writing down battles, his decisions, anything that was important. So we should talk about the government. So the government in Egypt was headed by the pharaoh, or paro in Hebrew. There were 170 different pharaohs that ruled throughout Egypt. Each pharaoh had absolute power. This means they had total power. They didn't have to share it with anybody. They had power over all of the laws, and they had power over religion. This kind of government, where the leader is in charge of both the actual government and religion, is called a theocracy. So if the pharaoh wanted to make a new holiday or a new god or a new religious law, he could, because he was in charge. And people listened to the pharaoh because they believed that he was a god, or at least related to the gods. Pharaohs got their power through a...
Created using Powtoon.